Welcome to the latest edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice. We have a very busy and interesting selection of items for discussion this morning with an excellent panel of speakers, and I'll get to them in a second. If you want to ask any questions or pose a question during the course of this programme, then there's a Q&A function that you can use to pose your question, and it may be answered live during the course of the programme, or it might be we might get a written response to that. If you're minded to do any tweeting, we're recommending the hashtag Last Month in Criminal Justice. A bit of a mouthful in a hashtag, but the best we could come up with at the moment. So yes, hashtag Last Month in Criminal Justice. So for this morning's programme, I'm joined by three excellent panelists, experts in a variety of different areas. Kate Coleman from Keep Prison Single Sex, Rona Epstein from Coventry University, and Peter Neyroud of the University of Cambridge and a former Chief Constable, amongst other things. And we're going to be discussing 6 items today. In a bit, we're going to come on to the question of pregnancy and childbirth in prison. Then we're going to talk about latest developments in the challenging area of transgender prisoners. We're then going to move on to the question of whether the police have a woman problem. We're going to then look at deaths in custody and round off with the prosecution, or what feels in many cases for many people, the non-prosecution of sexual offences. But we're going to start with something that you can barely have missed. It's been in the news all over the place, the policing of Partygate. And I'll start with a quote from a newspaper. Boris Johnson celebrated his 56th birthday yesterday with a small gathering in the cabinet room. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and a group of aides sang him happy birthday before they tucked into a Union Jack cake. So reported the Times newspaper on the 20th of June 2020. A year and a half later, the birthday party or gathering or meeting, depending on your preference, is at the centre of a political storm over alleged lockdown-breaking parties at Number 10 and other government buildings. This includes alleged parties the night before the funeral of Prince Philip and rumoured parties in the Prime Minister's Downing Street flat. Last week, the Metropolitan Police announced it would investigate a number of these alleged parties, having previously declined to do so. The decision, the Met claimed, followed evidence it received from the inquiry led by the senior civil servant Sue Gray. She published an update on her work earlier this week, and it made for uncomfortable reading for the government and its supporters. So the question here really, at least to get us going, is are the Met latecomers to this particular party, or have they rightly tried to avoid getting sucked into a political row? What is the correct relationship between the police and their political masters? Can it ever be anything other than complex and fraught? And we're going to start with some thoughts from Peter Neyroud on this. Peter, I mean, the Metropolitan Police have really had it in the neck, actually, from almost all sides in relation to this investigation. And perhaps whatever they'd chosen to do, someone would have been unhappy about it. So where do you see the state of play on this at the moment?
Well, I'd be inclined to take I'm going to take a step back a bit further, because you have to think about this across the 2 years of nearly 2 years of the pandemic. What were the police trying to achieve? Because this is unusual for policing and criminal justice, by the way, more generally, and that is that what policing and criminal justice are trying to do is to prevent harm and loss of life in a primarily health emergency. And the police found themselves with the primary duty of trying to enforce restrictions, although actually what they did right from the start, the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing did right from the start, was to say, actually, that's the wrong approach. Let's focus on trying to encourage compliance. So they did something which, based on the best evidence on legitimacy, that emphasised the 4 E's. So particularly encouragement, education, before we ever got as far as enforcement. So right from the start, they were trying to, and actually, if you look at the number of tickets that the Met and others doled out across the UK and compare it to the rest of Europe, I mean, the British police have been incredibly restrained in giving tickets. Their judgment was that that was the primary. And by the way, there's quite a long history of this kind of territory being seriously problematic for the police. There were vaccination riots in the 1880s when the police tried to enforce mandatory vaccination for smallpox, and annually about 3,000 prosecutions a year in the 1880s, and to the point where actually people gave up on the idea of mandatorily enforcing a health requirement through the law. So the lessons of this go back quite a long way. I also happen to be, through this pandemic, a member of SAGE, as part of what's known as SPIB brackets, Policing and Security, which is a long title for we give the government advice on policing and on the impact of restrictions. And our focus was on encouraging compliance right from the start. And I also, by the way, have been doing a lengthy piece of work for the United Nations on the global impact of COVID-19 policing across the world. A couple of things that shine through on that, first of which is politicians generally, and that doesn't matter whether you're in China, West Africa, or other parts of Asia and North America, made a pretty dreadful job of the regulations. Virtually no frontline officers in the first iteration understood precisely what the regulations were about because they were so rapidly and poorly drafted. And that didn't get a lot better. In fact, we had 120 changes of regulations through the course of the pandemic in the UK alone. And probably that's one of the reasons why the current investigation is looking a little bit complicated, because at different points there were different provisions. And the interpretation of what was or wasn't a garden or a park bench or what was exercise, etc., wasn't altogether well drafted, because the purpose of the exercise was to encourage compliance with the general major issues. And through the SAGE data we got, in general, the level of the population's compliance was remarkable. I mean, much more remarkable, for example, than France or one or two of our other neighbours in that respect. So let's come back to the current furore. There's a good reason, I think, why this is important beyond the minutiae and the excitement of who did or didn't have a party in number 10. It's important because I can't imagine, from the kind of work that we were doing in SAGE at the time, what the impact on the population would have been of some of the facts that appear to be in the some of the facts that we are reading, which obviously are now currently being explored in detail, but some of the facts about behaviours in number 10 on compliance, had we known about them in June, July of 2020, on the ability of the government to secure subsequent lockdowns with the high levels of compliance that we had. Now,
one of the things, I mean, the thing about that Times report, I mean, that was in the, that was in the largest circulation broadsheet. They had a party, and that was reported in June 2020. Yeah. And it passed by almost entirely unremarked at the time. And I think that's interesting in itself in relation to what you were just saying about the importance of ensuring compliance and the role that politicians play in modelling.
Yeah. Well, we saw, I mean,
like to see in others.
I mean, I thought one of the more fascinating pieces I heard on the radio recently was the fact that Barnard's Castle had experienced the most astonishing increase in the level of tourism, people wanting to find out exactly why it was so helpful to go and test your eyesight in Barnard's Castle. But on a more serious note, the reporting of that event actually had a measurable impact on public's willingness to comply for quite some period of time. Just as, on the other side, the over-eager enforcement by one or two police forces in the early months, notably the use of drones and a range of other things, the technology to enforce a health requirement was perceived by the public to be stretching the deterrence envelope too far. I didn't like that, and most police forces stopped doing that kind of thing and followed the compliance data quite carefully. When you come into this particular scenario kind of late on in the day, well, we're past the point of the original purpose, because we're moving from pandemic to endemic and have been for quite some time. So it's not about the original purposes, which were to prevent harm and loss of life. This is now about situation where something has been raised which is perceived to be so significant and serious in itself that it now requires to be investigated. And I suppose the lesson for me on that is you talk in your question about what the relationship has to be. It is complicated. I investigated the death of Dr. David Kelly in the midst of the Blair government. It was an extremely difficult case to investigate. I was enormously assisted in that by the relationship between myself, the head of the civil service, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector Constabulary, and the DPP, because I took advice from all three. Of course, in this circumstance, you can't take advice from the head of the civil service because it's quite apparent that he's conflicted. That poses a challenge in itself. The HMIC is no longer a senior cop, with a different type of advice. I mean, I'm sure the DPP would be enormously, and is undoubtedly being enormously helpful. But when you start to get into this territory, you need, as the chief or the commissioner, as many friends as you possibly can to provide you with guidance in order to provide a means of investigating where you are making judgments that are fair to the individuals you're investigating, but also perceived to be as impartial as possible. And it's a really difficult landscape. I still get Twitter abuse on the basis of the investigation into David Kelly from a variety of nutcases. But I also had an MP write a book which accused me of collaborating in a conspiracy with the CIA, and I didn't, by the way. So it's kind of difficult to do these things without getting insults hurled at you. You're muted, Richard. You're muted.
Thank you. Don't know why. Yeah, I mean, the police are being, they were being accused of basically turning a blind eye to obvious abuses and therefore being in the pockets of government. They've more recently been accused of saving the government's bacon, or at least Boris Johnson's bacon for the time being, by initiating an inquiry which allows them to kind of, as it were, kick the can down the road. So it kind of feels as if the police are in a bit of a sort of a, I'm not, always the most kind of, strongest supporter of the police, I think, as you know me, know, but it does sound like they're in a rather kind of, no-win situation here. If they don't investigate, they're criticised. If they do investigate, they're criticised. No doubt, whatever the findings will be and the degree to which those will be in the public domain, they're likely also to be criticised again. And that's, leaving aside the kind of the broader political ramifications of that.
Well, I listened very carefully to what Cressida said when she announced that she was going to institute an investigation. And I think, broadly speaking, what she was saying is it had reached a tipping point where the original specific intent was that the enforcement of the COVID regulations, which, by the way, has primarily not been about prosecution, it's been about administrative penalty through a fixed penalty notice, has primarily been about sanctioning non-compliance rather than about prosecution, and also sanctioning non-compliance that is happening now rather than looking back in the mirror, because the purpose of the exercise is about preventing the spread of the disease. Going and prosecuting somebody 6 months after the event, in general terms, doesn't serve that purpose at all, and therefore it's not part of the approach. There comes a point, however, which is what I think she was saying, where the allegations are of a different nature because they go to the heart of integrity in government, and at that point she felt compelled to investigate. But there's no conspiracy going on here, and I'm sure there's been a considerable reluctance to get involved. And having dealt with some kind of difficult issues, because I was also an advisor to 5 Home Secretaries alongside the Chief HMI, and I kind of know this stuff is really difficult. And it's when as it were, one bit of government, the political part, comes up against or has to have a problematic relationship with another part, and both investigating leaks or investigating breaches is really difficult territory, and I don't envy the Met the challenge.
And now, like a number of people, I'm sure I've sort of been following this story quite closely on the news, and the kind of the sense of anger and dare I say, cynicism amongst, many people who are popping up on the news, and as far as one can tell in the opinion polls and others, is fairly palpable. And I guess there is an understandable cynicism and suspicion that, just as some would feel there were perhaps, one rule for us and one rule for them when it came to observance of lockdown restrictions, that might also be true in relation to any, fixed penalty notices or broad prosecutions that might flow. A kind of a sense that maybe the Met will treat the members of the government and civil service with kid gloves. What's your kind of sense of, what steps? Because I imagine the Met won't want to, people to draw that conclusion. So, what's your kind of? Do you have a sense of what steps they will themselves be going through to try to ensure that any investigation is done in the most transparent and open fashion, in a way that isn't going to come back to, as it were, bite them on the bum later on, regardless of the ultimate outcome of their investigations?
Well, of course, the facts are that in this case, there is one rule for one and one for the other, because in general terms, you would not have gone back and looked at these events retrospectively with the policy that had been set about COVID enforcement. So it's not quite as the public view it, but I perfectly understand it. I mean, I'm not alone in feeling distinctly upset about it. I mean, I spent 2 years working on trying to advise the government in the best way. It's not particularly comfortable to see that that it appears that not everything was being done as it should have been done. So, and it will be good to see the final result. I suppose the answer for the Met is to be, and from my experience of, with the report into the death of Dr. David Kelly, it is absolutely impossible to put some of this stuff to bed. I mean, there are still people that think, as I said, there was some form of conspiracy going on there, which there most definitely was not. But I think what you can do is be as transparent as you can be. You can't be completely transparent because, the individuals here are getting a ticket. They're not being taken to a magistrate's court and being prosecuted. And there are some basic rules about that don't necessarily go to the point of publishing all the names of the people that receive tickets. So some of that is inevitably going to be less transparent than the public might want it. But they are actually going to have to try and be as fair as possible in the circumstances and as transparent as possible. And it's never going to satisfy everybody in those terms, because inevitably the major focus is going to be on the Prime Minister. But there are undoubtedly some people. I mean, one of the reasons why it seems to me that the process needs to be handled with care. I mean, for example, there are quite a number of examples of police officers. One I particularly pick out, where a police officer in Wales took his autistic son for a walk slightly outside the 20-mile radius that he was supposed to, got a ticket from his colleagues, and then got put in front of a misconduct panel and was in threat of losing his job for the breach. Well, clearly, if there are facts proven in number 10, there will be civil servants losing their jobs as well, I would imagine. And so therefore there's a general sense of wanting to do this job thoroughly, professionally, and as fairly as possible, despite the glare. And it's a very serious job that has to be done here, not something to be undertaken lightly.
And finally, and quickly, before we move on to the next item, do you, if you were to kind of estimate how long you think these investigations are likely to take before we know the result in relation to what the Met are doing, do you kind of have a sense in your own mind of how long you would expect it to take before we hear something?
Well, the difficulty here is it's always the balance between being, very, very thorough and doing it quickly. And I suspect they will err on the side of thoroughness, and that means it'll take a little longer than you might hope. I mean, if as reported, we're talking about hundreds of photographs and significant numbers of members of staff involved, they will need to put after all, the issue here is, have you got an excuse for doing what it appears happened here, or an explanation, satisfactory explanation? And if you haven't, well, then that might well result in a fixed penalty notice. So you have to give people the chance to have their say and to put forward their explanation for what was going on, and that means you have to go through each of the events and each of the people who might be there. That's quite a considerable undertaking. So I don't know, but it won't be this week and it won't be next, I shouldn't think.
Thank you very much. Really interesting issue, and we may well return to it in future programmes, but for now we should move on to the next item. Before I do so, there's a question here in the Q&A. Do the penalty tickets give the opportunity to dispute them in court? Suppose a junior number 10 staffer doesn't accept one. I think, Peace, you've partly answered that in relation to you have the kind of opportunity to explain whether you have a reasonable excuse, and you may or someone else may want to type a further answer or comment in the Q&A. Do keep those Q&As coming in, and we'll now move on to the next item. In June 2020, a young woman gave birth to a stillborn child in the toilets of Style Prison in Cheshire. Miss B, as she was referred to in the official inquiry conducted by the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, was not aware that she was pregnant at the time of her imprisonment, but she was left in acute pain for several hours without a proper assessment being offered. This distressing incident follows the case of Ms. A vulnerable 18-year-old woman with a background in care, who gave birth alone in her cell in September 2019 while on remand in Bronzefield Prison. Her baby died. When Miss A appeared again before the magistrates after her baby's death, she was released from prison and allowed to await trial in the community. Writing on our website in January, one of our panelists, Rona Epstein, argued, we need a complete rethink. The starting point must be that no pregnant women should be in custody. And Rona is the co-author of a new report. Here, I've got a hard copy, a rare thing these days, a hard copy of a report, or a copy of the report. A new report published in January called Why Are Pregnant Women in Prison? Rona, why are pregnant women in prison? And you'll need to unmute yourself.
Right, why are pregnant women in prison in England? We're not looking at Scottish law, we're looking at England and Wales. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say who did this research, because so far you've only said my name, and we are in fact a trio. So there's myself from Coventry Law School, there's Dr. Geraldine Brown, a sociologist at Coventry University, and then there's Maria Garcia de Frutos, who is a lecturer in midwifery at City University, London. We felt the need to have a midwife, of course, on board to discuss these issues and to look at these issues. So we were three, and we started this research, as Richard said, after the horrific incident of Ms. A losing a baby and being in prison on remand. So we asked, why are pregnant women in prison, whether on remand or on recall or on sentence? So we did a small study. We only have 22 women, but it was still indicative of lots of issues that are important in looking at why this happens. Our research followed that of Dr. Laura Abbott, the University of Hertfordshire, and Miranda Davies of the Nuffield Trust, who looked at what happens to women who are pregnant in prison and what happens to their babies. So our research followed theirs and found, like they did, that the women in prison were extremely vulnerable. No surprise there. We found them to have suffered mental and physical ill health and homelessness, domestic abuse and coercion, and other extremely negative life circumstances. So why were they there? Well, in our small sample of 22, but it reflects what goes on generally, the largest cause of them being there was recall. I think we all remember the 2014 reform called Transforming Rehabilitation, which imposed probation supervision for 1 year on anyone leaving prison, however short the sentence had been. Now, this, of course, had a laudable aim to provide support, because it's been found when people leave prison, get no support and reoffend. However, it didn't work that way. There was very little support. I can give you an academic article referencing this, but what there was a long process of discipline. The supervision had a disciplinary effect, and if any conditions of it were breached, the person was back in prison. And 6 of our 22 spent part of a pregnancy in prison for breaching probation conditions.
So just so I'm clear with this, what you're saying is that these are women who may have served a prison sentence and weren't pregnant at the time.
Indeed.
Released into the community at the end of their sentence, got pregnant in the community, and then not because of a fresh offence, but because they hadn't kept to the terms of their release from prison, they were then sent back to prison pregnant, basically.
Exactly, indeed. And the most the clearest example of this is Kathleen, a woman who did not fill in our online survey, but this was a reported case in the press, and I was able to apply to the court for the court records. She had done shoplifting, which none of us consider a very serious offence, although it is an offence. She had probation conditions, became pregnant, became homeless. She was living in a car park at the time of a second offence of shoplifting, once again, came before the magistrates. They activated a suspended sentence, which they have, of course, a legal right to do, punished her for the breach of conditions, sent her to prison for 11 weeks, and she was 30 weeks pregnant at the time. So this is an issue that comes up in our report, and I don't have time to discuss it, but that's part of the answer of why were pregnant women in prison. The other answer was for offences, and the greatest offence was shoplifting. So I'm not going to go through the report. It's there, it's publicly available, everybody can read it. I just want to make one point, and that is, with the help of Penal Reform International, we were able to obtain information on other countries, because there are pregnant women in every country and there are offences in every country. And Penal Reform International gave us the information that there are 11 countries together having a population of 646 million people, so nearly 3/4 of a million, anyway, over 600 million people, who do not imprison pregnant women. They have put it into legislation that if a defendant is pregnant, they may not enter prison. So they do other things. They have facilities for probation supervision, for house arrest. They widely use electronic monitoring, and they also suspend the sentence. And our report argues we can learn from these countries, and we can have laws to prevent pregnant women from going to prison. After all, the unborn child is innocent of any offence. And referring back again to the report of my colleagues, Laura Abbott and Miranda Davis, the unborn child suffers in this atmosphere, partly because of the stress imposed on the mother. We all know the mother and child health is related. It's one medical specialty, maternal and child health. So that was our plea at the end, to change the law, to use other facilities, also residential facilities, which are non-punitive and which exist, which are explained in our report, and say to ourselves, we are not going to imprison pregnant women. No court should endanger the life of an unborn child.
And this was, there's a question here in the Q&A, or sort of an observation and a question. Prison is far from the best place to have a baby. In relation to pregnant women in prison, how far does the law uphold the primacy of the interests of the child under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? And I think, again, Rona, I think you sort of hinted at, an answer to that, and we might want to explore that. But I'm really struck by, your observation that, most women, pregnant women, I mean, it's probably true of most women actually, in general in prison, but certainly most pregnant women, they're there for very minor offences. These are not individuals who are a danger to the public. And if prison is, what everyone thinks about prison is reserved for people who pose a threat, to the public and maybe in some cases to themselves, then it's difficult to see how a pregnant woman who's been caught shoplifting fits that bill, whatever the kind of the local shop owner might feel about their actions. So it's kind of striking that we seem to get it so badly wrong in this country. I kind of wonder whether we have these things called mother and baby units, a provision for nursing mothers and for pregnant women to give birth in prison and to stay with their children, their babies, up to, I think it's 2 years.
18 months.
18 months, thank you.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you kind of think that makes perfect sense in the sense of you need to have those facilities. On the other hand, I guess there's always a risk that it actually creates the demand, precisely because you have those facilities available, and so we don't maybe think rather more imaginatively about how to resolve what's ultimately a relatively small problem in terms of numbers of women involved.
Yes, and there are very few women who commit serious offences. In our group, they weren't all minor offences, but some of them are these famous drug offences. And I think that's another subject for another day. But reforming the drug laws is also part of the story. It seems to be that the male perpetrators who are using women to transport drugs are now today deciding which yacht to buy, or which mansion in Saint-Tropez is the most suitable one. Their women victims of their criminality are sitting in jail. And in our case, in these 22 women, there were indeed 3 there for drug offences. So not everybody regards that as a minor offence, but to me, it's very problematic what we do about drug offences. And some were minor offences, shoplifting, some of them were more serious. But in every case, I think we could have made an argument that this person could have been safely kept in the community, closely supervised, allowed to have her baby in the community, and then face the courts.
The old cliche about most women are in prison because of the men in their lives.
Indeed.
Peter, I think you had an observation on this. Did you want to share?
Yeah, well, so for the last 8 or 10 years, myself and colleagues from Cambridge have been testing experimentally deferred prosecution with conditions, keeping people out of the formal court system, but nevertheless with conditions and a requirement for compliance. We're just completing the replicating trial in the Metropolitan Police area. There's a very significant level of positive outcome for it. I have no idea why most of the minor offences, and it sounds as if they are minor offences, could not be dealt with that way. Keeping young women and their unborn children out of the formal system in the first place, and managing, and that includes the drug side of things, because we've also got Project Adder, which is applying the same provisions to those with a chronic opiate and cocaine addiction, and trying to provide treatment, which seems to me to be utterly in the interests of the unborn child as well. So, trying to be a little bit more imaginative, and be a bit more thoughtful at the first instance. I mean, clearly, if it's homicide, they will have to be in some form of constraint. But I think other than that, and other than more serious offences, it seems, fairly crazy not to be using deferred prosecution.
Yeah,
we're going to have to move on.
Absolutely agree.
We're going to have to move on in a second from this item. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, both of which really relate to, political appetite for any change. Are there MPs who are supportive of changing the law to stop imprisonment of pregnant women? And is there any interest from government at the moment to address this? A quick thought from you, Rona, on that, and then we'll need to move on.
I can only say it's a work in progress. We're hoping for that. We're looking at that, and there's a petition to sign because public opinion plays a big role. And Neela has sent the links, and I hope people will consider signing the petition so that change can happen.
Thank you. Yes, and that's a petition. It's actually referenced at the end of the article by you and Geraldine Brown on our website, and it's a petition that's being organised by Level Up Birth Companions and Women in Prison. So we'll certainly make sure that in the follow-up email we include a link to that petition, and I'd encourage as many of you as possible to sign it. Thank you very much, Rona. Let's move on to the next item. Keep those questions coming in on the Q&A, but we're going to move on to another item, another prisons-related matter, but it's in relation to trans prisoners. The prison rules, which govern the operation of prisons in England and Wales, state that, quote, women prisoners shall normally be kept separate from male prisoners. Around 3,200 women and girls are currently imprisoned in England and Wales, vastly outnumbered by the around 76,000 imprisoned men and boys. There are good grounds for argument that the vast majority of these women and girls are imprisoned unnecessarily. But for as long as imprisonment is used as a punishment, ensuring that women and girls are not imprisoned alongside men and boys should be a pretty uncontroversial policy. This clear policy position is complicated when it comes to transgender prisoners. Most male prisoners who identify as women are already held in male prisons, with a small number being housed among female prisoners in the women's estate. While female prisoners who identify as men can in principle be housed in the male estate, in practice none are, for reasons not difficult to grasp. As a result, male prisons remain single-sex institutions, at least in relation to the prisoners, while women's prisons are run de facto as mixed-sex institutions. Earlier this month, members of the House of Lords, led by the former Home Office Minister Lord Blencathra, tried unsuccessfully to change the law so that all male prisoners, regardless of how they identify, are held in the male estate. Kate, I think at last reckoning there were about, and you'll know the figures better than I, 10 to 12 male prisoners who identify as women currently held in the women's prison estate. Given that we're talking about a total population of over 3,000, why is this such an issue when we're talking about such a small number of males in the women's estate?
Well, I think you encapsulated the problem that we've got very well, which is that the female prison estate is currently being run as a mixed-sex institution. The numbers we know are, as you say, currently quite small. We know that there's about 10 prisoners, male prisoners, who identify as female, as women, held in women's prisons. I think this matters. It matters for all sorts of reasons. We've heard from Rona the extreme vulnerability of women in prison, that there's histories of male violence, histories of domestic abuse, coercion in terms of the pathway into offending. Coercion from men is often a big part of that pathway into offending. They've been in prison for relatively minor offences for a lot of the time. And to state the obvious, women in prison have to use the spaces that they are told to use at the times that they are told to use them. You know, we often hear what I consider to be a completely unreasonable argument that, well, if you don't want a male person in your single sex space, then just go somewhere else, use a different toilet, use a different changing room, wait until they've left, and then you can go in. That's clearly not the case for women in prison. I think we also know that the small number of women's prisons, it means that, you know, potentially there's enough for at least 1 or 2 male prisoners to be in each female prison in England. And, you know, that in itself is quite significant. So just dropping 1 male prisoner into a unit, into a prison, it can have really quite a catastrophic effect on the women inside. You know, we're in touch with some female offenders currently in prison, former female offenders who've been held under the current MOJ policies. And, you know, they report real fear and anxiety, even in the absence of assaults or sexual assaults, which, you know, the MOJ are confident have not taken place under the current policies. Our conversations with women say differently, but there's real fear and anxiety. And then, of course, you've got the constant knowledge that you could be imprisoned with a male at any point during your sentence. You know, your space, your facility may currently be single sex for females only, but that could change, and you've got no say in that. Just one quick point of correction, though. The amendment that Lord Blencathra and the other peers brought to the House of Lords at the beginning of January, it wasn't that all male prisoners who identify as transgender should be held in the male estate. It was that where there is a very reasonable, risk-assessed reason why a particular male prisoner should not be held within the male estate, that prisoner could be held in a separate unit, specifically tailor-made to serve the needs of transgender prisoners, but that they would not have access to women in prison. Because, you know, this is one of the key things. It should be about prisoner safety. And if there really is a set of compelling reasons why members of this group cannot be held in the male estate, even on a vulnerable prisoners unit, that's a separate question from why they have to be given access to women in prison within the general population. And that amendment sought to bring that focus back to prisoner safety. And I think it's quite interesting / shocking that even bringing the focus back to prisoner safety, at least some male prisoners, it seemed to be so important that they are actually given access to women in prison in the general population. Thank you very much. And Rona, I'm not sure whether you have any thoughts on this. I mean, I was struck at the moment there is a unit at Downview Women's Prison precisely for male prisoners with GRCs that give their legal gender as women. But this was a unit, I believe, that had been previously earmarked for a women and kind of women's health facility for the female prisoners at Downview, which of course was not possible then because it was redesignated as a trans unit. So there is a kind of, particularly, we all know that prison resources are very tightly stretched at the best of times. And as we, in the previous item, as we found out, at least probably some of the issues around, these appalling deaths of babies in prison probably can be put down, to, poor resourcing, poor training of staff. So I just wonder if you have any kind of thoughts really about, how this particular question interacts with some of the broader questions about, welfare of female prisoners in the female estate. And you'll need to unmute yourself again.
Well, of course, it is a complex issue, and indeed the resources are very tight, and it doesn't seem to me at all right that transgender persons who are identifying as women and whose identification as women we can respect, but who are biologically male, could safely be housed in a women's prison. At the same time, I imagine they're not very safe in a male prison. So it comes back to resources, but it seemed to me that the human rights compliant answer to respect the human rights of the women prisoners and the transgender ones are special units. I don't know, Richard, maybe have such special units being created to protect these transgender males from the violence that's endemic in the male estate, and yet not to impose them on the women's prisons, which would seem to be completely wrong and, again, completely unsafe. Have these transgender units ever been established anywhere?
Hey, do you, I think you're probably in a good place to answer.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. Firstly, the unit at Downview, it's not a unit that's specifically for male prisoners who identify as transgender, who've got a gender recognition certificate. The use of that unit is for male prisoners from that group where their behaviour has proved to be too risky and dangerous to be managed in the general population of a female prison. They're then allocated to the Downview unit as a temporary measure. The intention is that they should be assisted in progressing back to the general population of a women's prison. And in the meantime, they are still able to access the main prison at Downview and mix with women for the purposes of accessing the regime, medication, gym, library, etc., etc. So the question of resource allocation, I think, is absolutely vital here. You know, this was a perfectly nice 16-bedded unit, which could have been used to benefit the women at Downview, and that's now been taken away. You know, I understand from female offenders that the unit has been sitting empty since November. The last male prisoner who was held there has been transferred somewhere else, but it's now sitting empty. And, you know, getting back to the issue of prisoner vulnerability, I mean, you know, as Richard said, the large majority, overwhelming majority, are held within the male estate. 94% of male prisoners who identify as transgender are held in the male estate. So there's 6%, which equates to about 10, who are held in the female estate. Are you really telling me, is the MOJ really saying that it is beyond the wit of the male prison estate to manage to satisfactorily meet the needs of these prisoners if it's an issue of vulnerability? You know, we know that the male prison estate, it's not a nice place at all, and that there are many different groups of prisoners who are vulnerable. You know, whether that's gay prisoners, Black and minority ethnic prisoners, old prisoners, disabled, religious, you know, depending on the index offence. There's all kinds of reasons for vulnerability. And I really struggle to accept that the vulnerability of these minority of prisoners from this particular demographic necessitates them being held elsewhere, where that argument is not made for other prisoners, other male prisoners who might have equal or exceeding levels of vulnerability.
One of the things, I mean, the language you're using here, Kate, you're referring to, you know, sometimes referred to as trans women, you're referring to them as male prisoners who identify as women. I mean, it's a terminology I tend to use as well, and sort of, you know, likewise in the relation to female prisoners. Now, this often leads to accusations of transphobia. Yeah, and one of the difficulties with having a discussion about this is it very quickly escalates, you know. So what would your response be to those who argue that by referring to such prisoners as male prisoners who identify as women, or male transgender prisoners, whatever the preferred terminology is, rather than trans women, that you are, and I by extension, but you are feeding a transphobic narrative? You're kind of denying their existence, as it were. What would your response be to that?
Well, I mean, I think the deliberate changes in the language around this area, it's been, you know, I've looked very closely at the way language has developed. You know, we used to have the term trans woman, which was one word, which denoted, you know, somebody who wasn't a man because you've got a different word, but possibly wasn't a woman either because you've got trans woman. Then you get the separation. It then becomes trans adjective, woman noun. So now a trans woman is a woman modified by the adjective trans, just the same way that a Black woman is, or a Jewish woman is, or an old woman is, or a lesbian woman is. And you find that, you know, I believe that is a deliberate attempt, unfortunately, to channel the debate and to confuse the issue. We're not talking about a class of women. You know, we are not talking about a class of females, you know, and you can only be a trans woman if you are of the male sex. I'm female, I can identify any which way. I can never be a trans woman because I'm not of the male sex. And we have to focus the debate. You know, transphobia would be if I said, you know, any male prisoner who identifies as transgender should automatically get a life sentence because they are transgender. That would be me being transphobic, me recognizing the reality and the importance of sex. And we know throughout the criminal justice system, sex is the most significant variable when it comes to analysing offending, to risk. And that is what matters. You know, the MOJ, their risk assessment their imprisonment, the way the male and female estates are run, the reason why we have the female offending strategy is because we understand the importance of sex to offending and to the management of offenders. But here we're encouraged to believe that it doesn't matter. And the confusing, I believe deliberately confusing, use of language around this, where we have to talk about transgender women, trans women, it encourages that. I mean, one of the MOJ documents, which is the Equality Impact Assessment for Downview, it refers to transgender women and non-transgender women. Really? I'm sorry, that's just... It's not good enough, and it's confusing, and we need to be absolutely clear, and that's why clarity of language is really important.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to move on a second. There's a couple of questions that come in. There's one about the process for trans prisoners and whether they're enabled to continue a transition while in prison. There is a whole policy around that, and we can certainly share the link to that. But the short answer is yes, prisons are under instruction.
And I think it's also important to point out that even those convicted of violent and sexual offences, the most serious violent and sexual offences, are able to get a gender recognition certificate when they're in prison. And again, I think it's important to point out that there's no requirement for either any medical treatment or surgical treatment in order to obtain a gender recognition certificate. I think that points, because, you know, these hypothetical examples that we quite often hear are very divorced from the reality of the prisoners that are in the female estate with women.
Thank you. And you mentioned, Kate, towards the end of your earlier point that, you know, there is an issue about data and the significance of sex as a category in terms of, you know, administrative data, criminal statistics, and criminal justice policies more broadly. And I know, Peter, I think you had a thought on that. I don't know if you wanted to just quickly share that.
Well, the discussion is straight to one point, but there are a growing number of points where the system is confusing itself by failing to have this debate properly. And the most obvious one to me is the recording of rapes as being perpetrated by women when there's a transgender offender. And that has a real danger of skewing our understanding of rape and serious sexual assault. And, you know, I think it is not in our widest interest to simply shut down this debate because it is, quote, transphobic, whereas what we need to do is to have a proper debate which takes account of the interests of women. We're going to discuss rape and serious sexual assault towards the end of this discussion. It's a very, very serious issue, and to confound it in this way seems to me to be seriously problematic. The debate has to happen, and it has to be allowed to happen with people putting their views across without being shouted at.
I mean, 100%. And I think, you know, we know that the official crime statistics have been skewed by the recording of male offences and male offenders within the female stats. I mean, we know that police are recording crime and incident reporting by gender identity, including for rape, which, you know, in some ways is a relatively easy statistic to start disentangling. It's the other serious offences, which are very rarely committed by women, but which can be committed by women, where the rates are then falsely inflated by the inclusion of male offenders. And disentangling that and working out what's the proportionate response throughout the criminal justice system to, you know, I think at the beginning of last year, the BBC reported that there'd been an 84% increase in child sexual offending amongst women within, I think it was a 4-year period or a 5-year period, with a rate of sexual offending against children by women is small and stable. So if that is a genuine 84% increase, that is remarkable. And it requires a very specific response, but you don't know what's going on because the data at source have been permanently corrupted. So there's not any gold standard that you can go back to go, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? I know Kenny McCaskill has been sort of trying to investigate this with Police Scotland, and he's got a letter which he's given me permission to share the contents of. It's from the assistant constable of Police Scotland, and in that letter he says, yes, we record by gender identity, but you need to know that if DNA evidence was collected which contradicted the recording of gender identity, we wouldn't then on that basis correct the recording that we've made. So if a male offender is recorded as female on the basis of gender identity, DNA evidence then goes, actually this is a man, that original recording as female would not be corrected. And I find that absolutely extraordinary, that in the face of hard scientific evidence, no, feelings and identity and subjectivity comes first, and that's what you have to record. That's in nobody's interests.
Thank you very much, Kate. This is something, this general issue we covered in one of our earlier programmes last year, and I suspect we will return to it in the future. There is the current policy around the management of transgender prisoners is currently under review by the Ministry of Justice, as is a separate policy on searching and intimate body searches. And one of the crucial questions they're wrestling with is, what happens in the sense of a male prison officer who identifies as a woman. Should they be allowed to strip search a female prisoner? So there's a number of kind of potential dilemmas and problems that emerge from this kind of rather confused discussion that we're currently having as a country and in policy circles. And I can only agree with Peter and others that and Kate obviously, that we need to have a much clearer and calmer discussion on these very, very difficult and complex issues. You're listening to Last Month in Criminal Justice, and coming up in the programme, deaths in custody and prosecution of sexual offences. But before we get to that, we're going to explore the question of whether the police have a woman problem. In May 2013, a master's student at Royal College of Music, Cosca Duff, witnessed the police stopping and searching a 15-year-old boy. After speaking to the boy and trying to give him a Know Your Rights card, she was arrested, taken to a police station and subjected to a strip search. 8 years on, and these days an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nottingham, Dr. Duff last month received an apology from the Metropolitan Police for, quote, the sexist, derogatory and unacceptable language the police officers used during her search. She also experienced physical injuries. As she told Women's Hour last week, the overwhelming feeling of it was of physical pain, and I was terrified. They were kneeling on me with their full weight. They had my hands in cuffs, and they were jerking them around behind my back. Also last month, Kate Wilson, an activist deceived into a relationship with an undercover police officer, was awarded £230,000 in compensation for breach of her human rights. The Metropolitan Police has admitted that undercover officers formed abusive and deceitful relationships with at least 12 women, including Kate Wilson. I can't compare what happened to me to the terrible things that happened to Sarah Everard, Kate Wilson said, but both stem from a culture of misogyny in the police. They try to say it's bad apples, but the whole barrel is rotten. And just within the last few days, there's been a report from the Independent Office of Police Conduct into some quite horrendous misogyny and sexism amongst police officers at Charing Cross Station. And the terms of reference of the inquiry into the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Metropolitan Police officer was published early in January, and we're expecting to see the results, at least of phase 1 of that inquiry, later this year. So it seems clear that in their beliefs and conduct, some police officers at least are steeped in misogyny. But is it a case of a few bad apples? Or, as Kate Wilson said, is the whole barrel itself rotten? Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, this is a very substantial issue, and it does lead on from the last one, which is the growing importance of policing, in particular chief officers, having a clear idea of what it is that they are doing in both in terms of the internal makeup of their organisation and also in their external focus, the type of policies and approaches that are focused on gender. I was saying to you before we started this session, I tried to, in a lecture I did with some of my master's students, I tried to, instead of doing, as it were, the normal thing when one's talking about diversity in the current climate, which is to talk about Black Lives Matters, I tried to talk about gender, and I got criticised by the students for talking about gender rather than Black Lives Matters. And I actually think the students are wrong. I think the gender is in some ways, it's at least as big, if not a bigger issue, and has been for a very long time. And it is kind of ironic that the police in England and Wales have one of the highest percentages of women across the organisation. 33% of the service is women. That, and by the way, compares with the US, which is around 13%, and in many police forces below 10%. And that applies as well, not just at the front line, it also applies at chief officers. There are more women chief constables than we've ever had in this country. It's a 30-70 split at chief officer. It should be 50-50. There is only one target that's appropriate for the gender makeup of the force, and that's 50-50. And that also comes alongside the other issue, which is if you look at the issues that are coming up and being flagged as a priority for the police service to tackle, over the last 10-15 years, increasingly those issues have been domestic abuse and domestic violence, rape and serious sexual assault, with a heavy focus on the impact that those offences have on women. And I would have to say that on none of those has the police service's performance been particular. And we're going to turn to the last one for the last issue, but none of them has the performance been startling. I would say, because I teach a lot of senior police leaders in policing, that they get this. I'm not sure they entirely know how to turn the oil tank around, but of course that does imply also tackling the issues inside the organisation, and that means that the 33% together with their 66% male colleagues have got to speak up and make it quite clear that this type of behaviour is completely unacceptable. I mean, the Charing Cross stuff, I mean, the behaviour there is just, it's not good enough for any human being, let alone for a police officer. It's absolutely disgusting. And I suppose the one thing that is, I don't agree with the kind of it's the whole barrel piece, because actually there's quite a lot of research that we've been doing and have been done by colleagues in North America and Australasia about what actually tends to happen is clusters of officers. So you get, and clearly there was a cluster in Charing Cross where a combination of the leadership, the supervision, and the makeup of the officer team creates the ability for this type of stuff to fester and happen and not be tackled. And the real key for chief officers is to be tracking what's going on in terms of the complaints and feedback, tackling anything that is being flagged up to them about bad behaviour, and being rigorous and firm in setting the style that needs to happen. And we're doing that across the long term, not just for one individual incident and thinking it's solved the problem, because this stuff is completely unacceptable. One of the major tasks of the police service is to be much better at dealing with crimes that impact on women, and without having the attitude of mind that faces the organisation in that direction, it isn't going to happen.
Now, some years ago, and you will remember this well, Peter, as indeed probably everyone here actually, the Metropolitan Police acknowledged that they were institutionally racist following the inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And more recently, it's accused of being institutionally corrupt in the handling of the investigation into the Daniel Morgan murder. So whilst, one can argue about whether whole barrels are rotten or just enough of the apples in the barrel are rotten, do you have any sympathy or for the argument that the police, whether it's the Metropolitan Police specifically or maybe the police service more generally, should acknowledge the possibility that institutionalized misogyny might be an issue that needs to be resolved? It's not just about individual officers with completely rancid and unacceptable views. There is something culturally and structurally about the police service that needs to be confronted.
Yeah, I've never been a fan of that particular term, apart from anything else, because most people never knew what the hell it meant. And it was applied with such liberal, it was like, you know, the reverse equivalent of whitewash. It was applied with such liberality and with such a lack of understanding that it actually in some ways concealed the issues that you were trying to tackle. I mean, going back to the Lawrence report, the issue there was that where Macpherson came to that conclusion was because he could see that things were happening. For example, the perceived disproportionality on stop and search, the failure to tackle some of the issues on hate crime, where the organisation knew it was going on and hadn't consciously taken action to tackle it, quite apart from a range of other issues he raised. But it was about an attitude of mind where things were allowed to bubble around and not be dealt with. It's been come to mean a whole range of other things, and in some ways it makes it very difficult for the organisation to progress forward. And I'm not sure that I would apply. I think it was also probably a mistake to apply it in the territory of corruption, because again, it conceals more than it doesn't help you get to the precision of what you need as a leader in order to get yourself and take yourself forward. In this case, you know, there are a set of things. There are definitely things around leadership and the development of leadership. And so I teach a group of senior leader apprentices from policing, quite a number of them from the Met. And these are big issues that we discuss in great detail. There are issues to do with the training of the supervisors. There are issues to do with the tracking of complaints and the action from the tracking of complaints. And there are issues to do with the rigorous tackling of and finding and teasing out the clusters of officers and groups that need to be tackled. All of that is about, you know, is the kind of things I would expect to do. I'm not sure that the tag actually helps you get there. Okay. What helps you get there is being precise and using both the data and your judgment in order to focus your leadership.
Okay. Thank you for that. We need to move on, but I suspect, given that these sort of stories and allegations are coming at us fairly thick and fast, I suspect it's not unlikely we'll return to a further discussion of this issue in a future programme. But thank you for your thoughts, Peter, on that for now. Our next item on deaths and self-harm in custody. We discussed deaths and self-harm in prison in the November 2021 edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice, where we asked the question of whether prisons were more lethal for women than they are for men. New statistics on death, self-harm and assaults in prisons in England and Wales, released late last month, paint a worrying broader picture. Nearly twice as many prisoners died in custody in 2021 compared with a decade earlier. That's 371 compared with 192. Self-harm incidents had more than doubled from just over 25,000 in 2011 to 53,000 in 2021. The rate of self-harm incidents in male prisons was slightly down in 21 compared with 2020 by 13%, but it rose by 16% in the female estate. Now, the data covering deaths, self-harm and assaults in prisons is entitled Safety in Custody Statistics. But this is surely a misnomer. What does it even mean to talk about safety in custody when it comes to institutions so marked by death, self-harm and violence? Rona, I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yes, indeed. It is truly horrifying that somebody takes his or her own life in prison every 4 days. Around about 76 people kill themselves in a year. That's one every 4 days. So there's a huge problem of self-inflicted death. And I decided to use my 4 minutes to show you 2 documents, to talk about 2 particular people, not the statistics, the human beings. So this is a document I'm showing you. That is a coroner's report. It's in the public domain. Anybody can download it. If you email me, I'll give you the exact reference. And what it tells us, it's a coroner's report dated the 30th of November, 2021. So only 2 months ago. And it tells us of a death of a young man. He was only 24 and he died in June 2019. He died by his own hand. He took his own life. He was only 24. So I expected the coroner's report to tell us something about the care of a suicidal young man of 24 in our prison, for which we are all as citizens responsible. What kind of care was available to him? Well, you can read this report once, twice, or 100 times. You will not find the word care, and you will not find any mention of how he was or was not cared for. The report does tell you that the prison knew he was suicidal because it speaks of the welfare checks. So he was checked to see if he was still alive regularly. And the coroner's report says that these checks were inadequate because they didn't require the prisoner to speak back to the person checking. They simply required the prison officer to look at him. They looked at him throughout the night and he appeared to be watching television. When somebody entered the prison, he was dead. I find it interesting that there was no report of this in any newspaper, any radio or television broadcast. He died in our collective care. He was 24. So what I'd like to do now is just say his name and pay respect to him and be silent. He was Connor Arthur Stephen Holt, 24 years old. So I remember Stephen Holt. Now I have a similar story, but this time it's a woman. And this is the document. It's research I did some time ago. It's again publicly available. I can send you the links. On mothers sent to prison and whether courts were conforming to the Human Rights Act, which said that the rights of the child need to be considered if a court is separating a mother from a child. So this brought me to the case of a young mother. She had 2 children. They were 4 and 8, so very young children, and she had been found guilty of fraud. She was known to be extremely vulnerable and to have attempted suicide. The judge sent her to prison, and these are his exact words. You will go to prison for 9 months on each of the charges concurrent. Go with the officer, please. And I want this to be carefully noted by the prison authorities. This woman is a serious suicide risk, and she is to be carefully watched by those who now have the responsibility for her safety. Go with the officer, please. 10 days later, she had taken her own life, and her 2 children, aged 4 and 8, were from that day without a mother. So again, I just would like, I'm not going to say her full name because her children are living with this tragedy. We'll call her Mary, but I would like you and us to remember her and to think about sentencing vulnerable people to prison. Prison is not a place of care, it is a place of punishment. And that's it. We can talk about it now.
Thank you, Rona. I'm out.
What can we say?
I don't know what to say about that. I mean, yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing those stories. I think it's a really important reminder of the individuals behind the data. And
yes, in the report I'm referring to, the study of mothers in prison, I do ask some questions after quoting those remarks by the judge. You can read his name in my report. I ask him the question, what training has been provided to judges in the criminal court concerning the treatment of women with mental health problems? I put this question to the Judicial College and I got no answer. My second question in my report was, the Corson report made a very detailed study of mental ill health among women prisoners did the Judicial College bring this report to the attention of all sentences? And again, I've been unable to find answers. So there are many people listening to this and taking part in this discussion. I open the discussion to them. Can anybody find out? Perhaps Peter has the status there at Cambridge University to get answers that I was unable to. Did the Judicial College ever do the training following the Corson report, which is as relevant today as the day it was published in 2007? Perhaps Peter could have a comment on if he knows anything, or anyone attending who knows anything about the training of judges.
Why don't we follow up that lead after this session, because we're quickly running out of time, which feels like a kind of, in one sense, quite an inappropriate response to what you just said, Rona, but time is against us. Right. There's a couple of observations in the Q&A about the independent review on the response to deaths in custody report from the Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland, and there's a link to that report, so thank you for sharing that. And there's a question here, is it true that most suicides in custody take place within 2 or 3 days of first remand? And I imagine we're first going to custody. I myself don't know the answer. I don't know whether...
I also don't know the answer, and maybe someone attending does, but I did note that in the case of the mother of those 2 young children, the suicide was 10 days after she entered on that sentence. So it was very close to the beginning of a 9-month sentence.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on. I mean, I suppose a quick sort of closing thought from me. I mean, we all of us in this panel, and I'm sure probably a number of people attending today, will have been in prisons and will have met prison officers and prison governors who are as distressed by deaths in custody as anyone else. So I think it's important to acknowledge the the really good work that many prison officers and prison governors do, whilst also recognising that there are failings, and that this is as much, if not more, about the nature of these institutions as places of pain and punishment than necessarily the individuals who staff them. But some really distressing stories that, Rona, you shared, and quite difficult to witness actually and to hear. But thank you for doing that. Let's move on to our final item. The latest criminal justice statistics released in late January show a 12% rise in the number of sexual offences recorded by the police. At nearly 172,000 in the 12 months to September 2021, it was the highest number of sexual offences recorded in a 12-month period. Rape accounted for 37% of all sexual offences recorded. And again, the 63,136 offences recorded was the highest annual figure ever recorded. Now, police recorded crime figures, particularly for sexual offences, are notoriously unreliable. Many victims do not come forward. The true figures must be much higher, even than those police recorded crime figures. At the same time, some of the rises in the police data has also been driven by improvement in recording practices. What is not in doubt is the strikingly low charge rate for sexual offences. In the 12 months to September 2021, only 2.9% of recorded sexual offences resulted in a charge. In the case of rape, it was 1.3%. This has led to claims that rape has in effect become decriminalised and to calls for more prosecutions and convictions. Against this, some argue that this is an example of carceral feminism, placing a naive faith in the criminal justice system to resolve deeply entrenched male violence and social problems, and again, by a system that itself is wrestling, as we've previously discussed today, with some very deeply entrenched misogyny, at least in some places. So what does the vanishingly small prosecution rate say about the priority given to tackling male sexual violence and what is needed to challenge it. Is it more prosecutions and convictions? Is it something else? Is it both and? Kate, what thoughts do you have on this?
I mean, what can you say, really? I mean, this is it seems to be a constant pattern of low prosecution rates, the conviction rates once the prosecution has happened don't necessarily seem to be completely out of kilter with other offences. But it just seems to be, I really take Peter's point about, saying that the police force is institutionally racist or institutionally misogynistic. It becomes sort of something that you can hide things behind. It becomes something that's so big that unpicking what's actually going on and trying to affect real change, that's what you've got to be aiming for rather than labels necessarily. But I sort of had a quick Google, sort of knowing that I was going to be talking about this, and I just thought, women, what do women see? We've referred to the strip search of Dr. Koshka Duff. We've referred to the spy cops. We've referred to, the police recording rapists as women on the basis of self-ID. There's the inappropriate sexual relationships with victims, serving officers being charged with rape, the catalogue of absolutely appalling racist and sexist bullying behaviour at the Met, with jokes about partner violence and rape, the photos taken of the murdered sisters Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, the particular problems that Black women face in having their reports of partner violence being taken seriously by the police. And, today I saw on Twitter somebody was retweeting a case of a Black woman who was humiliated by a police strip order. I mean, what can you say, really? I don't know. I mean, I do believe that, we need a carceral system. Yes, there should be, particularly for women. I believe there needs to be a radical overhaul of the way that we look at offending. But we do need a criminal justice system, and it does need to serve the needs of women. And I don't think at the moment that it is. I'm not sure I've got anything more to add to that, rather than just.
Catherine McKinnon wrote many years ago that the criminal legal process, this is paraphrasing rather than the exact quote, the criminal legal process doesn't prevent sexual violence and rape, it merely regulates it, and it regulates it from a male standpoint. And certainly, whilst obviously there are many offences where there is a significant gap between the number of recorded offences, or in the case of crime surveys, number of surveyed offences and prosecutions, it does appear to be significantly lower in relation to sexual offences than a number of others. Raises a question, if we're talking about 1.3% in the case of charges in the case of rape, even if that was doubled, 2.6% doesn't sound great either.
Not great, no. It's really not great.
Even if it was quadrupled, then 5.4% again doesn't seem like anything to get into, particularly kind of 5.2 rather, particularly excited about. And I guess the part of the argument that the carceral feminists, or the critique that it claims this is carceral feminism, would say, well, actually, if you really enforced it, then you'd be looking at tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men being imprisoned every year, of which the response might be, yeah, well, if that's what it takes, maybe that's what's needed.
That's what it needs. No, I think you're right that the criminal justice system, and we know that from the Coulston report and the Anglioni report in Scotland, that the prison service has been set up by men for men with male offending in mind, and you need a radical overhaul and shift in order to meet the needs of women. And I think that's true throughout the criminal justice system as well. I'm thinking here of cases where women have killed their abusive partners, and because it doesn't fit the model of a man who snaps in a moment of provocation, because the female experience and the difference between, you know, even just strength levels, you know, a woman and a man, and the way that you are likely to be engaging with it, with conflict and trying to formulate a response, that has historically served women who've ended up killing their abusive partners. That hasn't served them well, because it hasn't fitted that model of, well, you know, a man who snaps in an instant or who is being threatened, you know, it'll be a face-to-face, you know, confrontation. You wouldn't be picking that person at a moment of weakness in order to respond physically and try to incapacitate them, injure them, or even kill them. So yeah, I agree with you that you know, there is that kind of structural problem that's there, and it is very much biased towards a male perspective and a response to a male pattern.
And I think, you know, probably there's nobody here who would disagree that, you know, if we think about, you know, the toxic attitudes of far too many men in society, and the way that far too many young men are socialized and boys are taught certain attitudes, there's a massive amount of work that's needed to tackle you know, those kinds of attitudes and mentalities and behaviors, and of which actually, you know, kind of rape and sexual assault are one aspect.
Top level, yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the other arguments that's sometimes posed, I think possibly Catherine McKinnon may have proposed this herself, although others might correct me on this, is that, you know, the rules of evidence need to change, so that rather than you know, in the case of rape, for example, it having to be proved effectively that consent was not offered, you know, that those accused have to prove that it was not proffered. You know, that they actually have to prove, you know, that they're not, that they didn't commit rape or sexual assault, rather than, you know, the burden being on proving that they did commit sexual assault or rape. I don't know whether any of the panelists have any thoughts on that particular idea.
That's a tricky route to go down, Richard, because you want to assure a fair trial. I think that could end up with problems swinging the other way. To be frank, this is not the desire to sort this out is not confined to women. Let me please assure you. A great deal of the senior police leaders that I'm teaching at the moment, as superintendent, deputy superintendent level, this is an area they're passionate about sorting out, both the men and the women amongst that. The level of detection rate on rape and serious sexual assault is abysmal. Because it reflects a general fall in detection rates. I mean, take 20,000 cops out of the system, and you have got a problem with detection. And you've also had this increase in the recording of rape and sexual assault, which is both good news and bad, because concealed in amongst that is the automatic recording of every allegation made in the course of a domestic violence risk assessment, where the woman may well not have had any intention to report a serious sexual assault, but it's gone against the figures. That's not an excuse, but it's just a fact about some of the things that are going on here that affect this picture. The third one actually is just kind of getting people's heads around the fact that this isn't just normal business. This absolutely has to be one of the top priorities. I think I wouldn't quite go as far as one of the politicians who said it should be treated the same as terrorism. It's not the same as terrorism, it's different. It needs to be treated as a major priority. Once the police service gets its head around something as a major priority, it's usually pretty good at putting together the right combination. It needs support from research, because it's not a simple issue to tackle. It's not simple to try and increase the level of rape and serious sexual assault. There's a whole raft of issues, such as the complexity of all the data that police are churning their way through, and the inadequacy of the support to do that. It certainly needs a big rise in the performance of the Crown Prosecution Service, and they need to stop being quite so cautious about prosecution. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that you decide not to prosecute simply because you fear you might lose a case. The whole point of a trial is to test the evidence, and the CPS are extremely reluctant, from a study that one of my detective superintendents did, extremely reluctant to test the evidence, even when almost any situation where something fails one of the tests, the whole thing goes out. Well, that can't be right. You must be prepared to test the evidence. And then the kind of, there's all the issues around support and what the expected outcomes are, and the strong connection between being equally effective in trying to prevent homicide in domestic violence as well. Those are two critical issues that the police service absolutely has to step up the plate and do a damn sight better at over the course of the next decade.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. There's a few comments, a number of comments here. There's one, to what extent is this a crisis of legitimacy, repolicing and justice for women versus anything new? Interesting question. We might want to return to that in a future programme in this series. And also a helpful bit of information here. Thank you for this. Burden of proof was discussed in great detail during the sex offences review prior to the 2003 legislation. Thank you for pointing that up. Certainly look into that, and thank you. That's really useful information. But we are now out of time. I'd like to thank very much Peter Neyroud, Rona Epstein, and Kate Coleman for giving us so many things to think about, and for our audience, for your many really interesting thoughts and observations. Our next Last Month in Criminal Justice on the 2nd of March, we'll be discussing, amongst other items, joint enterprise. But before that, we have a lunch with Donna Mooney and Shirley De Bono. Donna was one of our earlier panelists at a previous Last Month in Criminal Justice, and that's on the 9th of February, and we'll be discussing the campaign against the imprisonment for public protection, the IPP sentence. And then also actually in March, we'll also be returning to joint enterprise when we'll be having lunch with Gloria Morrison and Jan Cunliffe of Jengba, again talking about that campaign for reform in relation to joint enterprise. So plenty of interesting events and webinars coming up. You'll hear about them through our bulletins. So if you don't receive our bulletins regularly, do sign up for them. And thank you very much for coming to this latest edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice. Thank you very much. Goodbye.